You talked in the book about hunger being one of the most significant qualities needed to make it as a professional footballer, and sacrificing everything to the god football. You're talking about 15 and 16-year-olds who are putting their education totally on hold in order to become professionals, but potentially not make it, and even if they do, at a lower level only for 8 or 9 years. What do you think that says about football as a model for, maybe for parents looking at it and thinking, do I want my child to do that?
It's really fascinating. I think, firstly, it is pretty brutal. There's no way of getting around that. The second is that hunger was almost this magic word, and I interrogated this in the book. You talk to a coach, or at least the ones I did, and ask who's going to make it, who's not going to, and they say the hungry ones. And my read on this was that actually a lot of it, yes, it's about how good you are and how hard you work, but a lot of it is about human connections. Does a manager like you? Is the scout there at the right time? Do you avoid injury? And hunger was this kind of accepted code word for actually what was a lot more intangible. Now, the system is certainly, the wastage is savage, right? So we've mentioned already, you get an academy deal at 15, your prospect of being involved in the game, 15% 5 years later. But what is interesting from that are the knock-ons, and particularly the knock-ons when you factor in social class. So football is a very working class sport. That goes back to the 19th century, the division with rugby. It's very apparent in the language. I found it very interesting that gaffer was the ubiquitous term of art for manager. But there seemed to be a clear difference in how that offering of an academy place was perceived by working class families and by middle class families. And I'm very wary to generalise here, but in certain cases I spoke to, or there were multiple examples I heard of middle class parents profoundly balking or even refusing to allow their children to take up an academy place at 15. And that is because it's very hard to continue your education. So you can't really do A-levels. There are examples of people who can, but it requires special measures, and also it's often actively perceived by coaches as a sign of insufficient ambition, that you're not focusing everything on football. So usually you do a level 3 BTEC in sports science. And I went to the college where they're doing this, and again, it was a slight dissonance between what the coaches were saying about how this was really valuable, and you could tell who was going to get a contract by their attitude in the classroom, and the young men themselves, who, to be honest, looked a bit disinterested in what they were doing. So there is this BTEC there, but it's not really adequate. It's not. There is very little fallback. But at the same time, this is kind of complicated feedback loop that the odds of you making it are really, really low. But it's not a straight numbers game, and in order to make it, you really have to believe in yourself. So maybe you do have to put absolutely everything into this to chase it. And the other side of that is that working class families would regard a football career, particularly now given the money in the top flight, as a way out, maybe not only of the child's socioeconomic situation, but that for the entire family. So they would put everything into this kid's success. The system is brutal. It's very important to say this is not a unique thing to Luton at all. It's much wider in the sport. The obvious other counterexample of how to do it is the American system of university athletics. And that brings, I've written about that brings a whole series of other problems with people who really aren't academic at all going into an academic environment. But the way to deal with this, it's very hard. And what is very interesting is I talked to the academy players, to 15 and 16-year-olds, and they thought they were going to the Premiership, right? And you talk to the older players, or rather you talk to the oldest players. I talked to Steve McNulty, the captain, he's 31. He said it's about playing bills. So the expectation or the idea of what you wanted to get out of it completely shifted. And where that hinge wasn't clear at all. But a lot of stuff has brutal attrition. Entertainment does, the arts does, the kind of work that we're privileged to do does as well. Again, Danny, the photographer who was looking at this through a lens of his experience with music, was saying, well, it's the same in a band. You want to be in music, you're putting everything into it. So I think there's something really wonderful about giving your all, chasing something with the most that you can. But it is hard. It's really, really hard, and your chances of making it are very, very small. But I don't think that's a reason not to give it a go. But the way the institutional setup is there, that yeah, you basically can't have any higher secondary education, let alone tertiary education. I think that's problematic.